Hi, Sandra. It's so great to connect today. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, you have thought a lot about topics that I'm very interested in. I wrote my dissertation on why I believe we are prone to underestimate artificial intelligence. And of course, that has a lot of implications for big data and things you're thinking about. So, as you think back on the work you've done, what lesson have you learned that you would most like to pass on to others?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because there's probably so many lessons that you want to pass on, but I think if you ask me about the most important one, it's really this idea that algorithms and AI, machine learning, whatever you want to call it, um, computers can just learn so much more about us by observing our data than I think we realize. And I've started comparing the ability of algorithms to predict really our intimate psychological dispositions, what we think, how we feel, how we behave based on the digital traces that we leave as we interact with technology. We use social media, we use our credit cards, we use our smartphones. I've started comparing this to my experience of growing up in a tiny village, which might sound like it has nothing to do with one another. But it's actually when I grew up in this village of 500 people, so very, very small, the main experience was that everybody knew everything about me, right? So they knew exactly what I was doing on the weekend, who I was dating, which music I was into. And that meant two things for me. One is it was incredible. So looking back now, it was probably the time in my life that I felt the most supported because they knew what I wanted out of life, and they were just there to offer the best advice I've ever gotten. But it was also incredibly annoying and frustrating because
Mhm.
they were meddling with my life in ways that I didn't appreciate.
Mhm.
And I think, well, today I live in New York, right? I've left the village behind. I don't have neighbors anymore that know everything about me. But I feel like we all live in this, what I've been thinking about as a digital village. So we don't have neighbors next door that know everything that we do and then translate this into predictions of who we are and then prescriptions of what we should be doing. But there's all of these digital neighbors that trace everything that we do from, like, again, everything that you post on social media, your credit card spending, your GPS records on your smartphone, and the same way that my neighbors translated their observations into predictions of my psychology, computers can do the same. And for me, the really important piece here that I think we miss when we just look at what's being discussed in the media is I think in the media we oftentimes have like concerns about, well, what does it mean for our privacy? Now we have algorithms who can really make these very intimate predictions about our inner mental lives. For me, the more critical part, and I think that's the lesson that I want people to take away, is that it's not just about privacy. It's not just that someone is looking into what's going on inside your mind. It's much more about the ability to control your own life. Because the moment that someone understands that you're more impulsive, more neurotic, more extroverted, more agreeable, whatever it is, they actually gain a lot of power to influence the choices that you make, the decisions that you make, the way that you think, feel, and behave. Again, the same way that my neighbors actually use their insights to meddle with my life, the same way algorithms can do that. And I think that's a lesson that should really kind of get people to listen up, both in a well, what are the risks of that, right? To what extent are we losing control, and to what extent are we still even in charge of our own lives, but also in terms of opportunities. So if there's a way of tapping into your psychology and understanding what are your motivations, fears, dreams, hopes, and so on, maybe we can actually use it to help us accomplish the things that are otherwise difficult to accomplish. So for me, that piece of we might be giving up a lot of power over our life is the big piece.
So I think this is really interesting, the idea of a digital village, and I've never thought of it in those terms before. And so it's not just about our privacy, it's about the ability to control our own life. So as you think about the ability that algorithms have now to learn about us and predict our behavior, how do you try to use this in your personal life to help you either, it, how does this inform either decisions you make or even things you share?
Yeah, it's a great question because on some level, I think the value from data comes when you pull in, right? So I can look at my like the example that is top of mind for me right now is like what is it that expecting moms should be doing while they're pregnant to make sure that they're healthy and their baby's healthy, right? So it's like one of the the most chaotic and terrifying experiences that you can imagine because you kind of see your doctor every 2, 4 weeks, but you want a day-to-day update and a very detailed plan of here's what you should be doing. You get advice from all sides and it's all contradictory. Now I can look at my own genetic data, I can look at my own biometric data, I can look at my own sleep data, but that doesn't really tell me anything. The value that I get from looking at data is if I can connect it to the data of other people, right? So if I have like a community of expecting moms, we all pool our genetic data, we can have the most amazing insights into, well, if you have those genetic markers in this sociocultural environment, here's what you should be paying attention to. Or if this is the challenge that you're facing, maybe here's a solution that you can try because we know from other women who have a very similar profile to you that this worked for them. So for me, it's like, it almost feels like we have to come together as a community to really make the most of our data. If I just look at my own data, there's only so much that I can learn.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, you're very thoughtful about this. It's about pooling the data so that we can then make better informed decisions for our own life. Okay, what scares you most about where things are heading, or just what scares you most about the capabilities of computers today?
Um, a lot, I have to say. But maybe we're also going to get to the opportunities because I think there's also a lot more opportunities than there used to be. But I think the risk is, I would say twofold. One is, and I think maybe the most obvious one is now that we have generative AI and these language models that can have intelligence that's not super specific to one particular task, you can imagine that the ability of computers to look, both look into your psychology and then change it is just on steroids. So it used to be the case that I needed a proprietary data set with someone's digital traces and their psychology to train a very specific model that takes, let's say, someone's credit card spending and turns it into predictions of their personality. So that was like a pretty big hurdle for people to build these models. Now I can just pop someone's social feed, I can pop their credit card spending, their Google searches into ChatGPT, ask it to make a prediction about pretty much any psychological dimension that you can imagine. Take personality, values, moral foundations. And because it's read the entire internet, I never needed to train it specifically to predict personality from someone's social feed. It just knows it. So I
Yeah.
can ask ChatGPT, well, who do you think this person is given the social feed? Are they more extroverted, more introverted? And it is a pretty remarkable job. So that means that suddenly anyone can do it, right? And maybe that's great for democratizing science, but it also means that if we were worried about the likes of Cambridge Analytica, for example, a 15-year-old kid in the basement of their parents' home can pretty much do the same thing now, predicting the psychology of millions of people without them ever being aware of that. Plus, they can then use the second part and use generative AI to create content that speaks to all of these different people without ever having to recruit a creative team that knows exactly how to speak to extroverts and introverts. So just the mere ability of scaling this up is remarkable.
So my dissertation looked at the reasons why I believe we are prone to underestimate AI, and it all rests on the premise of exponential growth and the exponential growth bias. So generally, throughout human history, we've lived in a very kind of linear world. We don't really see much exponential growth. Um, and when we do encounter it, we're always surprised how quickly exponential growth can happen. Um, like the example of the lily pads covering a pond. If it's taken 30, if the lily pads are growing exponentially, and it's taken 29 days for the lily pads to cover just half of the pond, how many more days until it covers the whole pond, right? And it's just one, right?
It's
And
one, yeah.
so it might take 29 days to get halfway there, but in the exponential world, you're one day away from
Yeah,
100%. And exponential growth is especially relevant because computing speed is the backbone of AI. And the
yeah,
faster computers get, and the more data they can process rapidly, the better AI gets. And so what AI is capable of doing today, we would only expect it to just continue to blow us away in the coming months, years, and decades.
yeah, 100%. And it's in a way also what I probably fear the most and what I see as one of the biggest problems right now is that if you look at like how we're trying to deal with this, if how we're trying to deal with privacy, with the ability to make our own choices, even the most progressive data protection regulations, right, in Europe and in California, they're all about transparency and control. They're like, well, you should be the steward of your own data because you know best how you want to use data. I think what you just described is the best example for why that's not true. Right? Technology moves at such a light speed that
Yeah.
it's impossible to keep up. I do this like full time. This is like what I think about pretty much 24/7. And I have a hard time figuring out, first of all, where we are right now, let alone where we're going to be in 1 year. So if that's true, like if we don't have a shot at understanding exactly what happens to our data now and in the future, it's not really right to be allowed to manage your own data. It's much more of a responsibility and a burden that I don't think we're equipped to take on. Like even if we did understand it fully, it's still a full-time job, right? So if you were to carefully figure out what are the terms and conditions of all of the services that you're using, how could this potentially be a threat to you in the future, it would be more than a full-time job. And I think most people have better things to do than just going through all of these terms and conditions. Hopefully they get to spend time with family and friends instead of just reading the sec 200th terms and conditions.
And ultimately, it's going to require an AI to be able to learn all the things we need to learn.
Yeah.
Okay, we talked a little bit about some of the fears, some of the scarier aspects. What do you see as some of the opportunities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and you don't see this as much in the media, right? So if you look at the media and you look at AI, it's either, well, it's the big companies profiting, which is true, or it's like we're all doomed. And I think there's so much potential to help us with some of the goals that we have that we typically struggle with. Savings is one of the examples that I like to go to because it's something that I've studied. So most of my early career I spent on trying to get people to spend their money on products. So I kind of showed how you can use psychological targeting to understand people's psychology and then use it to sell them more beauty products and so on. And at some point, it's like, well, what if we could just flip it on its head and instead of trying to get people to spend more, can we use the same technology, the same principle to help them save more, which is one of the behaviors that most of us struggle with, right? We all have the best intentions, and then most of us failed pretty spectacularly at putting those intentions into action. So what we did in this study is we surveyed the users of a fintech company that's trying to help people with very low levels of savings. So in our case, it was people who had less than $100 in savings to save another $100 over the course of 4 weeks. So this is might not sound that much, but it's doubling people's savings, right, in a relatively short period of time. So it's a pretty big lift. And what we did is we kind of sampled and surveyed their personality with their consent. And then we came up with all of these messaging that was trying to see, well, how can we make saving more appealing to people? Right? If you're someone who's very agreeable, so cares about their social relationship, is like very trusting and caring, you might not necessarily save because you want to have more money in your account. You also don't want to save because you want to outperform all of your neighbors when it comes to buying the next luxury car. What you really care about is saving money to make sure that your family is protected in the now and in the future. So we just kind of twisted these messages that we send people to really appeal to their psychological traits. In the same way that we managed to get people to spend more on products, we also in this case managed to increase the percentage of people who managed to save these $100 by about 60% over the existing gold standard message that the company had been using up to this date. So it was like a very nice way of kind of showing how the same technology used in two different ways for two different purposes could accomplish very different things.
Really interesting example that I've never thought of. I could imagine, 1,000 years in the future, people looking back at us before the invention of AI, and we're trying to create messages to influence behavior, and they're thinking like, wow, those people were living in cave, like they're like cavemen, like
Stone
their
Age. Yeah.
models were so crude.
Yeah.
And now we're using AIs that can take in millions and billions of data points to craft messages to
Yeah.
influence behavior. So interesting. Well, any final words as we wrap up here, Sandra?
I mean, I'm just building on what you just said because the interesting part for me is that we're almost coming full circle. So you kind of projected into the future. For me, a lot of the stuff that we're doing and trying to replicate with AI is actually what we're doing in the offline world all the time, right? So any conversation that you have is personalized because that's what humans do extremely naturally. So we don't even notice that we talk to a 3-year-old very differently than to our spouse or to our boss or to our mom. So I think many of the ways in which we're using personalization now to scale and convince and persuade people, we've been doing for centuries, just in a much smaller context and in a way that was bidirectional. Right now, it's like companies doing this in one direction,
Yeah.
targeting millions of people. It used to be the case that it also worked the other way. So, but I think that's an interesting way of just considering technology in the context of what human behavior has looked like naturally for quite some time.
Well, this has been so interesting and fun for me as I think about this a lot as well. And there may be nothing more impactful in our lifetime than the creation of AI. So thank you for spending some time with me. Congrats on the new addition to your family. And just really appreciate you sharing these lessons today.
Thank you so much.